편의상 제가 영어로 진행하도록 하겠습니다. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we live in a rapidly changing world, and therefore it is crucial for us to understand what the change means to us and what policy implications it has. Particularly, you look at the international economic and financial environment. So many changes are going on, and therefore it is very important to figure out what all those mean to us. This morning we are very fortunate to have Professor Krueger, who will enlighten us in this regard. Since Professor Krueger has been with us many times before, number of times before, so I don't think I need a long introduction for her, but I just want to let you know again that she just left IMF as the first managing director, but she still keeps the office there as a special advisor to the managing director of IMF. As you know, this first managing director, what the post at the IMF is highly demanding post, and it is critically important post for the global economic and financial community, as you know. And so she was there for 5 years as the full 5-year tenure there. I'm sure many of you have read media reports. She exerted very strong leadership there in initiating various programs which contribute a great deal in maintaining global economic and financial stability. And also she introduced various reform measures for IMF for its own operation, and the financial community appreciated it as much. And as I said yesterday at the Korea International Traders Association meeting, said that her contribution there will be more and more appreciated and recognized by the international financial community. And before she joined IMF, you know that she was vice president at the World Bank. Before that, she taught in various major universities in the United States, including the University of Minnesota, and Stanford University, and Duke University, and so she had a brilliant academic career, and which was fully recognized by her fellow economists in the United States, to be selected as the president of American Economic Association, which is really an honor for any economist in the United States. I was saying yesterday, I'm going to repeat it again, that I won't be surprised if in near future Nobel Committee will nominate her. I really mean, because Nobel Committee emphasized both theoretical contribution and the application in solving real world problems. So she was at the World Bank and IMF. So I really think if I were a member of it, definitely compare her. Yes, I think it's a possibility there is a finger crossing. Most important, actually, she has been associated with many of us in Korea working together, and our former Deputy Prime Minister Dr. Kim Manje is there. When he was president of KBI, when I was there, we started working together. And since then, she has been coming to Seoul many times. And she's a good friend of actually Krueger. And she wrote many books and articles on Korea, and she keeps following up on the Korean economy. So this is a very good opportunity to have her back again, and her share my 19 views. With this few words, I'd like to invite Professor Krueger. Please join me. Welcome.
It's always a pleasure to be in Seoul. It's a pleasure to see this group again, and pleased to be here. What I want to do today is to talk about major trends in the world economy, with a view to trying to ask where are we at the beginning of the century. And toward the end, I will then spell out what I think are the broad implications of most countries, but in particular for Korea. It seems to me one can fairly easily start trying to look at the world economy today if we really begin in the early post-war years, remembering that there had been a tremendous age of globalization in the 19th century, from 1850 to 1914 really. It had been broken by the First World War, then never recovered, and then we had the Great System in the 1930s. So by 1948, the international economy was probably less integrated than it had been in, let's say, 1870. There had been a real retrogression. And I think it's important to remember that. There's nothing that we can take for granted about the progress that we've made, because the fact that we've done very well does not prove we will always continue to. But be that as it may, after the Second World War, many people were looking at what had happened, and they did not want the same bad things to happen again. The result of which was the attempt to build an international economic system, which has served us fairly well until today. The post-war recovery began fairly auspiciously in the late 1940s, mostly in the industrial countries, and I date the first period of expansion really from about 1948 to 1973. That period saw world economic growth as a whole more rapid than it had been in capital terms or in total terms. But it was the industrial countries that led that growth that grew more rapidly. The developing countries was somewhat widened, although they did better than historically too, not because following the trends of the industrial countries, because they were benefiting from the strong economic growth and the strong trade during that period. What really happened was that there was an effort, of course, first to revive after the Second World War Japan, and with that, an effort to liberalize trading relations internationally through the GATT, as it then was now the WTO. Almost nobody now remembers that European trade barriers in about 1950 were as horrendous as almost anything you could find out in the country 20 or 30 years later. There were quantitative restrictions on everything. Most trade was hard, and one of the early American efforts was simply to get east up so they didn't always have to be market palaces. It wasn't until the 1950s that European countries went to great convertibility. It was a slow process. As of about 1948, when the first round of GATT trade talks started, the average height of tariffs of the European countries that were in the original European Union was 46% on manufacturers. And of course, that was treated quite differently. Obviously, then, the 1950s were a period during which the tremendous trade liberalization internationally, and at the same time, the Europeans began integrating themselves, partly for political motives and partly otherwise. And Europe achieved pre-war production levels by the 1950s, but if anything, accelerated its growth going forward. And one of the lessons that came out of that very quickly for everybody was just how important trade liberalization was for economic growth. Now, that trade liberalization was both external, i.e. to the rest of the world, but it was very important. Trade was the engine of growth, and growth accelerated during the 1960s. As a rule of thumb, trade expansion was about twice the rate of GDP throughout that period. And trade and manufacturers grew at about 3.5 times the rate of GDP during that period. In a sense, that 25-year period from 1940 to 1973 was a golden age internationally, and the whole had not been equaled until, guess what, the last 3 years. We're up there again. At that time, it was almost miraculous. Nobody expected it to continue. Japan, income doubled in Japan. Japanese group, the 48 to 73 period was a period of revival of the international economy, especially in the industrial countries. But with the developing countries, leaving themselves out of the system, closing their doors on trade for the most part, cutting import substitution for development, benefiting by world growth so that they didn't suffer too very much. As everyone here knows, Korea has very few exceptions to the developing country story, and I'll come back to that later, but which was the first decade of rapid Korean growth. Korea was so small that the picture in the world really talks about developing countries, and not this much at that time, I would not by that time. So the developing, by 1973, the industrial countries had been growing rapidly. Some countries had been growing, but not as rapidly. Gaps in per capita income were increasing, not decreasing. One other thing I should note before moving on, and I'm going quickly because there's lots more to say, is that capital during the 1950s and 1960s were highly restricted, completely convertible currencies as of 1968. Some degree of capital controls. Most capital flows were either official flows or labor term. There was very little private long-term capital. That which there was largely mostly in minerals and a few other commodities, raw funds, and foreign capital moving around the world at that time. So if you want to know what's happening, you look at the regional development banks, and for the most part, that told you much of the story. In the 1960s, everybody now seems to have forgotten who we were and breaking the markets, which helped finance Korea's growth, and in the process proved that the developing countries could be done with, which was very important later on. But Korea was a fabric. But let's move on quickly to the 1973 to 1990 period. By 1973, economies were well on the way to integration. There was recovery primarily internationally. Trade barriers were falling as a result of repeated rounds of trade negotiations. And price increases 73, 74. Part of the reason for that was that the period had been one in which there had been some degree of inflation. People had worried inflationary pressures picked up, especially by the late 1960s. were rising. And by 1973, oil joined the oil price increase of that year, which then led, of course, to a recession the year. In that period, however, the thing that did happen that was important later on, the developing countries who were oil importers were able to access the banks in the industrial countries, and in effect, the industrial country banks recycled the petrodollars, financed their continued growth throughout the decade. So developing countries and borrowing from the oil exporters indirectly. Trade liberalization continued. The Tokyo round was finished in the late 1970s to a point where the 1980s concern in most of the industrial countries. An effort to control the growth of money supply in the United States and Europe, and with that, the interest rate shot up in both nominal and real terms. The United States primarily corrected high in 1981, and most of the borrowing in developing countries was very low rates. The result of which was the debt crisis of the early 1980s. On the part of many countries as to what their policy should be, and the beginning of the change, I think, for most developing countries, not Korea, not Taiwan, not most of the others, away from the old import substitution models that had worked very well and sustainably. Now, one of the things should be mentioned about that is what we're understanding now, and that is that Japan, of course, continued growing very rapidly, and they were improving their market position in many goods. One of the things that's important to remember now is that the Americans, or many of them at least, began undertaking reforms of their own markets. But one of the first things President Reagan did was let the air traffic controllers stop it. And then labor law was changed so that the power of the unions was some other reforms were undertaken, which had the effect of making the country much more flexible. You probably remember some of the headline issues: airline deregulation, airport deregulation, the railroads were deregulated, a number of other things were done, and over that, was not performing well, undertook a series of reforms. So in the 1990s, I'm trying to hurry to get to current, and I think I'm just hitting the high points. I think the 1990s, although nobody in this room will believe me, was the emergence of the transition funds. Not the financial crises, although I will come to them in a minute. That was the private capital began flowing in very large amounts. You could go back to the 1980s and you could find any number of quotes from public bills that say that the debt crisis of the 1980s meant that private lending, private capital flows to developing countries resumed. Well, if there was one forecast that ever was wrong, that was it. It resumed. In the early 1980s, even at the time of the debt crisis or before the debt crisis, more than half of the developing countries were official. By the 1990s, it was less than 40%. Where the private financing was big, and that had a number of implications. But another thing in the 1990s was the emergence of a number of the countries that had been doing decades as to becoming major players in the international economy. Korea had been doing very well for several decades, and by the 1990s was already a significant, because no longer a small country going very rapidly, it was big enough to matter. The same could be said for another. And meanwhile, other countries had, of course, learned from the Korean and other examples. Not only had China, which is obvious, and maybe Chile, which everybody knows about, but Brazil. And a number of other, what we now call emerging markets, began changing policy because they saw how successful some of the changes had been elsewhere. Policy reforms that were started then are still continuing in many countries. And earlier on in Korea, and somewhat more half-heartedly, you might even say. But I think there's a big difference, and I'll come back to that. But in addition to the American reforms, of course, we had the UK and the UK reforms. So we had a number of countries that had issues that had given them slow growth or what have you earlier. At the same time, people began declining. And one of the big success stories, in my judgment, of the past 20 years has been that inflation is no longer the worldwide threat that it was, and that in itself has created more satisfactory growth in a large number of countries. As of the late 1980s, average inflation in developing countries, taking out the very high ones that skewed it too much, the average was double digit. Now it's about 6% average. A few countries last year had double digit inflation. Only 3. And that was the OECD. Among the OECD countries now averages around 2%. And you as auditor see a list of deflation as you do of inflation. That's a remarkable change, and something that is making and will make a big difference for the 21st century. It should not be ignored. I mentioned, of course, the financial crises of the late 1990s. They came up in earlier success. Countries that had had what I'll call regulated financial systems had done fairly well because they were at a slow enough development so anybody could see where the lending should go. In Korea in the 1960s, yes, textiles, yes, anybody who could export deserves credit. We could ration. I think economies were much more complex than that, and it was no longer as simple as that. In any of the countries that had credit rationing throughout this period, rates of return on bank capital were falling quite rapidly. And in fact, Korea in 1993, a best estimate. They were propped up a bit by the government for a couple of years, but it could be. That reflected a failure of the banks and the financial system to grow as it should have. Until that time, it must be said, given the rate of growth in Korea and given the rate of growth, it's remarkable that there were not other policy failures leading to other earlier crises. Policy makes it very well, if you like, steering the ship through all the dangers, but the which finally caught up, and we had the financial crises. The first was actually Mexico. The second was, of course, Thailand. We then had Malaysia. We had Korea. Later on, we had a very different kind of crisis in Russia, but the Brazilian financial crisis had been much like the Asian financial crises earlier. So these came up because there had gone on too long a period of success where one fundamental issue hadn't been addressed. And that would almost be my most important message going forward now, that things are fine. There's some issues for these countries, and if they're not addressed, we'll come up and bite them at some point in the future. So let me then turn to the first decade of this century and talk about where we're at. So something, given the terrorist things, the events of 9/11, 2001, the geopolitical uncertainties that are happening and everything else, economic growth is as rapid as it has been at any time in the past 30 years, over the past 3 years, more than 5% per year in the world as a whole. We've had periods in the past where one region from every stage and so on. We have very seldom had a period where that growth was spread very widely over the international community. Even Africa, which has done, as you know, very poorly in general, has had more than 5% growth in the past 2 years. Even Latin America, which during the 1990s has had rates of growth above 4%. In each of the last 3 years, it looks to be having a good year. 3 years is not enough to write a history book on, but it sure is a good performance in countries in Latin America that averaged 0.5% per year for 10 years. Then doing 3% very good for 2 or 3 years running. And we are seeing more good performance in more countries with inflation and more attempts to address some of the fundamental causes. It is not of particular interest to Korea, which is not in the situation so long, but one factor that has hurt many developing countries have been their willingness and ability to borrow until their debt basically became unsustainable, and then the necessity to unwind the situation. Most of the developing countries have in recent years gotten their fiscal situation under control, and there is less concern, although they're starting in some cases with very high debt levels and heavily before they were secure in that regard. But the fact that all parts of the world are participating in this very macro is very significant. I didn't even mention the transition economies, and there are parts. Russia, of course, everybody says that's oil, but so has Ukraine, and Russia is doing well because of oil. Ukraine, why is it doing well? One could look at these things one by one and find particularly, but when it's the whole world, those who are commodity exporters, oil exporters, those who are oil importers, something else is going on. And I think part of the answer is that we have learned a lot. And one of the things we learned, of course, is macro stability. It's not been as noted or as appreciated, but even within countries, say Africa, and you ask which are the countries that are doing better, they're the ones that have more. If you look in Latin America, the same thing. The importance of macro stability was greatly underestimated earlier, and the contribution of relative price stability to our good performance is, I think, very important. Secondly, important is that productivity growth grows rapidly, guess where? In the United States, UK too. Just where you would not expect it, where you thought an advanced country growth for so long, obviously growth would slow down, it has accelerated. Part of this, I think, comes from part of it comes from the macro stability, part of it comes from other things. But there has been a demonstration that having grown for a while doesn't mean that you necessarily slow down. There are things that can be done, and that all countries need to do at any point in time in order to improve the functioning of their economy. So what are the hallmarks, then, of the 21st century? Let's start my focus. Well, first of all, unlike the period of 1973, there is no one dominant economy. Many parts of the world are now economically important. The United States is probably among equals because it is still the largest single economy. But Germany's exports are right up there. It's growing rapidly. Russia is entering into international markets. Some of the Western countries are doing very well. Japan seems to be recovering from her long recession. India's growth rate has averaged 7% or more growth now for the past 4 years, and on and on and on. You cannot any longer look at one or two economies and infer what will happen in the world. The Americans still have the lead in the sense that they're the biggest, but they're no longer, and that's the dominant force in the international economy. It used to be said that when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold, meaning that the American economy's recessions were so important for the rest of the world. That's important. So are Japan's, so are Europe's, so are other parts of the world. There is no same degree. And in terms of the first part of the 21st century, I think that's one of the phenomena that many people are not yet reacting to. Many people are still thinking that the United States will be the leader who can sort of call the shots, and everybody will come around for them to really doubt it. Our second lesson, though, and equally important, is we are increasingly understanding the importance of the financial sector. And some have gone so far as to argue that if the 20th century, the last half of the 20th century, was the period of rapid growth of international trade as it was, and trade was then the engine of growth, increasing flexibility and efficiency of the financial sector will probably be the hallmark of the half of the 21st century. I don't believe in single causation ever, and there's always more than one thing going on. But certainly one of the lessons we learned from the financial crisis was the importance of a well-developed financial sector. A financial sector doing its job allocates scarce capital on a risk-adjusted basis where it could be most productive. A poorly organized financial sector misallocates capital, which in itself cuts the growth rate, but can also lead down, as we discovered here, much to everybody's sorrow, can lead to financial crises and other things. It's interesting that there are many new innovations going on, and in financial mediation and in diversification of the financial sector, I suspect we've hardly begun. Just a couple of measures to give you some idea of what's happening. New financial intermediation. In the U.S., 1995, it was equal to about 5% of GDP. By 2005, we are estimating 60% of GDP. Australia's close. Australia was 43% in 1995. Some other industrial countries are way behind. Italy is at 0.2, much less than the U.S., 0.8. But those numbers are all low and rising fast. As I said, the U.S. went from 0.6 to 0.8. Australia is going up. It doubled, even though it's very low. And the dependence on a variety of financial sources, rather than one on a banking system, is crucially important. Having a flexible financial system, alternative sources of finance, suiting different needs, venture capital, angels, and so on the line, is clearly important in the whole thing. Asset-backed securities. In the United States, 25% GDP and rising rapidly. The Netherlands is the second best in the world, now with 10%. From there, you go down. Asset-backed securities have just begun internationally as important as they may be. One of the things that happened in Korea was that by keeping real interest rates low, they were positive but low, that meant that non-financial securities didn't have a really fair level playing field on which they could develop and grow. One result of which was, of course, that Korea was very dependent on bank capital, as a result of which, when things went wrong, there were no other sources of finance which could pick up some of the slack, as they can in other countries. Development of the financial system in ways that can allocate capital from the to best uses are going to be important nationally, and the countries that do best are the ones that are going not only to do it nationally, but to be able to take a leadership role globally. Now, we're learning about this. This is not something that's done and you go and you just take what's on the shelf and apply it. There are all kinds of interesting problems that are rising, and there's a lot of attention being paid to them. Right now in the United States, a great deal of newspaper and magazine time is taken up with the fact that London is getting more new listings of stocks to the New York Stock Exchange as a result. And the interesting question the Americans are asking is why? Is Sarbanes-Oxley doing it? What is it about Sarbanes-Oxley that may have gone too far? Finding the right combination of regulation, make sure the corporate governance and all that is appropriate, without, on the other hand, so stifling the financial sector to move offshore, is going to be a challenge for everybody. And it's a game in which everybody can participate. It is not a game where the United States and the United Kingdom can walk off with it. Either one has to be on their toes vis-a-vis the other, but also with respect to the rest of the world. And I would argue the countries that do the most in terms of improving the efficiency of their financial systems, and in terms of getting a diversified financial market, opening up, having foreign firms come in and letting their firms go overseas, are the ones that will succeed in the beginning of the 21st century. Finding the right degree of regulation and how to do it is a challenge for us all. It is not one where the final word has been written. There is still a great deal to be learned. Going on, the third thing the 21st century has two challenges as we all face different challenges. I'm going to come back in a minute and point out why they are very closely related to financial challenges. These two go together in strange ways, but let me just talk about it for a moment first. As you know, in many industrial countries, the labor force is expected to start declining. In Japan, it has already started. In Korea, on present demographic trends, it would be 2017. In Eastern Europe, Russia is already declining. Eastern Europe is going to decline quite quickly. Many of those countries have problems otherwise. In many cases, they have pension systems or healthcare systems that are already underfunded. Some of them seriously so. Now, then take those two things together. Right now, in a typical country, there are probably 2 to 2.5 people working for every old retired person. So if you're going to pay a pension now to someone who's retired, you've got to tax the 2.5 people about 20% each year, 30% each in order to get there. Okay. What happens when the ratio goes, as it will, to 1.5 to 1, or 1 to 1? Unless changes are made, the fiscal burdens in many countries are going to be very difficult. Now, everybody focuses on pensions, but in fact, in many countries, the health care costs associated with aging are going to be even greater. The estimate is, in the United States, health care looks like by far bigger in terms of where it's going, even in pensions, in terms of the problem. And the estimate is that in some countries, the percentage of GDP, the additional percentage, not the percentage, the additional percentage of GDP that will be needed on present plans, in other words, if they don't change it, in order to fund pension and health care costs, within the next 30 or 40 years, can rise by 0.5 percentage point of GDP per year. It is huge. It's a fiscal liability, major proportions, and it could spill over into the tax system, creating distortions, just at a time when taxes on labor are the last thing that anybody wants to do, because labor will be becoming the scarcer commodity. Now I go back to the financial side. As labor becomes scarcer, we have to get labor productivity growth rising, because that's the only way we'll get any increase in per capita income. So there's nothing else. No increase in the labor force, then it's got to be output per worker that rises. How will we do that? A major part of the answer has to be that we use our scarce capital, and I use the term scarce not in the sense that there isn't any, but in the sense that it's limited, as well as we can, which means a well-functioning financial system supporting the allocation of capital to its best uses. The more effectively the financial system can do that, the more likely we are to have more rapid productivity growth. The easier it will be to absorb some of the changes that are inevitably coming on the demographic side. Now, some countries are better placed than others demographically. Korea, I know, is not one of the well-placed ones. India looks much better placed than China. The United States looks much better placed than Western Europe. And, of course, demographic trends can change. But even if they start changing tomorrow, it's going to be at least 20 years before there's any impact whatsoever on labor force variables. Unlike other things, that's one thing we can predict fairly well for a certain period of time in advance. So unless there's some disastrous epidemic or something that starts killing the whole people, we really have a problem to be confronted with, and getting an efficient economy is a major way of doing that. So no increase in the labor force means productivity has to rise. That in turn means focus, I think, on the financial sector. Now notice in all this, I have not mentioned what is on everybody's headline in the world, and that's global imbalances. Relative to the things I've talked about, global imbalances are small and temporary. As I've been talking about, grow year by year, and over time they can be much more significant. In the early 1980s, you may recall, we had a discussion of global imbalances. There were the Reagan tax cuts, there were the twin American deficits, and there had inevitably to be a major adjustment. Well, time went by and it didn't happen. Why? Because the American dollar was floating, because the American economy was reformed. As I said before, it became more flexible, productivity grew. And so instead of having the crash that everybody talked about, in the late 1990s, the discussion in Washington was how shall we run monetary policy because we're going to retire all debt within a few years given government surpluses. So just about the time they cut out 30-year bonds and did some other things for that score, things shifted again. So now we're talking about deficits. There will be some adjustments, of course. What will they be? If Japan grows faster, Europe grows faster, as I expect they will, more funds flow to Europe. In and of itself, that will lead to something of a correction because there will be other parts of the world in which it will be healthier to invest than it now is. Japan has not been growing very much. Japanese investment has been low. As that picks up, that will already make a difference. If the European economies reform, as I think they will, again, that will make a difference. These things will happen. Meanwhile, one does have some exchange rates. If the Americans decided for whatever reason, and I perhaps think they should, that they need to have something of a fiscal adjustment, they have plenty of time. American debt to GDP is much below that of most of Europe. If the Americans now decided they wanted to cut the fiscal deficit over, say, 6 years, 0.5 percentage point per year, that can easily be absorbed. It's not a big deal. If they don't, there is, of course, always a risk that people will decide that they want up some of their American dollar-denominated assets. But what are they going to put them in? Where is the alternative asset that's so attractive that it can absorb large sums of this? Yes, the exchange rate could move, and in fact, you may know it has moved the last week or two. But that's a buffer. That's a variable that's absorbing some of this shock. It is not a source of concern in that regard. No serious person can deny that it is possible that there could be something like a seizing up of the international financial markets. Its likelihood, however, is very small. There are reasons why it would be good to adjust more quickly, to have the Americans and some others adjust and get their accounts more in order. But it's not, I don't think, the kind of issue that's going to be path-breaking in terms of where we go in the first half of this century. So slow down possibly, some discomfort, but not major. Let me then quickly turn, as I'm running out of time, to implications for Korea. The first thing is that Korea has a wonderful track record of adapting to changing things. I always like to use the statistic that Korea grew in any decade after 1963, in 10 years, as much as the most rapidly growing industrial country in the world did in the whole 19th century. Now, every industrial country in the 19th century had huge adjustments to make. Growth creates change, and change creates problems, and you have to solve them. For Korea to succeed as long as it did, I think it's truly remarkable. I think it's a major achievement, and it gives me comfort that I think in the future that same ability, that same adaptability will come into play and be a strength for the economy and for the people. Also, the countries that do best will be those that are most open and most integrated in the international economy. Korea has already gone a long step in that direction, and at least with regard to manufacturers trade, is already in very good shape. There is more to be done, and there are challenges. I mentioned greater productivity, and for Korea that's terribly important. It's important because of the demographic issues I just raised. It's important anyway. And in Korea, the evidence is that the service sector productivity is quite low, and most Koreans who know more about it than I do think it's because of overregulation. Korean service productivity is about 1/4 of manufacturing. The OECD average is 1/2. Well, that says that you could double service productivity, it just reached the OECD average. Okay? And doubling service productivity would be huge, given how big it is in the economy as to what you could do overall in terms of growth rate. There are also suggestions that quality of education and particularly university education, could be greatly improved in this country. And given that there won't be more people in the labor force, having people who have better skills when they enter the labor force will be even more critical, which makes education going forward particularly important, and an area where it seems to be for Korea there could be some focus. And I have to mention agriculture. I know it's a sensitive subject, but 8% of the Korean labor force is still in agriculture. The average in the industrial countries is 1 or 2. Well, if you could free up 6% of the labor force, that's equivalent to postponing the demographic challenge for about 6 years. That's big. 5-6 years' time is not something that's easy to do. On pension reform, if you could move the retirement date 2 months per year, you're making a big change. If you can find something that will give you 6 years, that's a lot. So I would argue that those things need to be there. And for all of that, finance is incredibly important. The banking system in Korea is healthy. Other financial activities are starting, but I do think there's scope for paying some degree of attention to whether indeed measures could be found that will enable a healthy financial system and diversification out of banking to proceed even more rapidly than it presently has. And of course I've already covered health and pension reform, which will be important here as everywhere else. So the 21st century, if we're to continue growing, is going to be some challenges to meet, the same as every earlier period has been. And flexibility is important in an economy for its own sake and for growth, but also in order to be able to meet whatever the challenges are we cannot now see on the horizon. There have always been surprises, and there always will be. And those economies that have the greater flexibility will be the economies that can meet them better. So there are all kinds of reasons for moving ahead on the lines I spoke of. Korea's per capita income now is estimated to be 70% of the OECD average. And on current estimates, I gather, people think that 4.5 or 5% growth is about the sustainable level. More reforms, making the economy more flexible, getting services productivity growing more rapidly, etc., could raise the growth rate, arguably by 1 to 1.5 percentage points on a sustainable basis. That would have the time it would take to reach the OECD average. These are not small numbers. 1.5% for 1 year doesn't sound like much, but if you keep doing it for a number of years, on top of the growth that's already happening, it could be big. I'm optimistic that it will happen. I'm still optimistic. I remain optimistic about the Korean economy, but that's where I would see the future. Thank you very much.